Chapter 1. Remember, Barrett, the most important quality of a ruler is upholding peace and justice throughout the land. I'm not really going to be a ruler though, am I, father? I mean, you govern a few cities, but there are people over you, and then the king, and all of Ashia is basically under control of the Ustane Empire, no matter how much they say we are independent. Barrett's father Alexander shook his head full of graying hair. Regardless of who is above us, we have direct impact on the lives of the citizens of this county. What if a neighboring area has designs on our lands? Do we just cede it to them to stay at peace? Barrett's father once again shook his head. Only in extreme cases. The first thing that should be done is to prevent them from having such ideas in the first place. If we show that we are strong and united, they will not think it is worth their time and effort to attack us. If it does come down to war, then one must make sure they have the upper hand in strategy and tactics to make sure their citizens can return to peaceful lives as soon as possible and with the least loss of life. That is just one aspect, though. After all, there are conflicts between citizens as well, and even between the citizens and us. What conflict would the citizens have with us? On the most basic level, taxes. They are necessary for the defense of the county, for roads between the cities, and for managing issues, but while everyone agrees these things are good, nobody will agree that the money should come from them when others could be paying more. Barrett nodded. I suppose so. It all seems kind of pointless when a wizard or warrior could just refuse to follow the law, and we couldn't do anything about it. Alexander sighed, while wizards in stories might have powerful magic, they couldn't just flaunt our laws. Most of them won't be able to take on a dozen trained guards, let alone an army. Even if there were one who could cause a real problem, we would petition the Duke to deal with them, and they could send an elite squad to deal with them. What about the very powerful ones? I hear they could defeat an entire army alone, even one with many elite troops. Alexander shrugged. If they even exist, they would not come to cause trouble in an insignificant place like this. However, I doubt they do. Robert, come here if you would. The imposing figure of the captain of the guard walked over and stood next to them. Robert here is quite skilled, and can take on a dozen competently trained soldiers by himself. However, it took him over a decade to reach this level. Even if he had some sort of special training method, he could only be a few times stronger before age would catch up. Anything more than that is just stories that we don't need to worry about. Oh. Barrett sighed, and settled down to listen to a long, boring lecture on taxes, the criminal justice system, and a number of other necessary but not terribly exciting things. Barrett swung the practice sword a few more times. His arms and back were aching, even from the relatively short session. His brown hair stuck to his light skin from the sweat. Perhaps he could do more if he trained more often, but he was busy with other lessons for now. Next year, when he turned 13, he would start real training. Though he wouldn't be a professional soldier, it was no good for a baron's son to be incompetent in any area. It would be a shame to the Ravenhall name, though his cousin in Tryridge did that enough for the rest of them. They tried not to think or talk about that branch of the family too much, though they were occasionally used as examples of how not to govern. Never to their faces, though, on the rare occasions where they came to visit. Here is your towel, young master. Barrett turned to see Reyna. She was his personal servant, though realistically she spent at most half her time working for him instead of performing general duties. Oh, thank you. Barrett should have brought his own towel, but he forgot. Not every time, but enough of the time that it was now regular. She would remind him of what lessons were next, or things he needed to prepare. His father told him not to rely on her so much, but what was the point of a personal servant except for that? Besides, he knew how much the old butler Cheriton did for his father. Reyna was the daughter of one of the other servants, and had grown up with Barrett. She was about a year older than him. That and her training helped her to cover a number of Barrett's insufficiencies, which he was grateful for. He didn't want to be late for things, but wouldn't always find his way to a lesson on time without her prompting. You have another lesson soon. You have just enough time to wash up and change into the clothes I left on your bed. Right. Barrett sighed. It's maps today, isn't it? I don't know what the point of looking at so many maps is when most of them are barely accurate. I imagine it is because it would be good for you to know all of the countries that might influence us. The same reason you are memorizing all of the names of the nobility. Have you managed to get further than the names of the attractive young women? I might suggest learning at least their fathers' names. Barrett coughed. It's not like. I just had an easier time memorizing the names with portraits, to connect them to faces. Of course. Then I will be bringing you sketches of all the grumpy old men who run nearby cities. I'm sure you'll be able to remember them then. Her face remained neutral, but her eyes sparkled slightly with mischief. Ah, right. I'm sure, that will help. Chapter 2. Barrett looked down at his plate and smiled. A good roast, not that the cook ever made a bad roast, and no sprouts. His parents and sister had sprouts, but he didn't. Barrett hated sprouts. Even so, as an earl's son, he couldn't afford to be picky about his food, but eat whatever was placed before him. Those were the rules, but Barrett recalled the incident from a handful of years ago. You must eat your sprouts, Barrett. They're good for you, his mother admonished. Barrett frowned. No. I don't like them. They're bitter and gross. Fine then. You'll get no seconds or other food until you eat your sprouts. With the rules thus declared, Barrett sat at the table with his arms folded for the duration of the meal. At dinner the sprouts were still there, and he continued to refuse to eat them. By breakfast the next day, the sprouts had started wilting. If you eat just one, you can have your breakfast. We know how much you love bacon and eggs. Barrett did love those. Meat was one of his favorite things, though he didn't hate vegetables. Not all of them, anyway. Not like sprouts. He sat through breakfast, his stomach rumbling. Later, Raina came to him. Young master. I snuck this bread and cheese from the kitchen for you. Barrett was famished. He could have devoured the whole loaf and the cheese wedge in a moment, but he shook his head. I'm not supposed to eat until I've had sprouts. So, I won't eat. His stomach growled in complaint. Are you sure? Yes. Now take that back to the kitchen. Oh. Raina looked down at her feet. Okay. Barrett didn't eat anything that day. The sprouts wilted enough to be disgusting, so he was given a new batch. He still refused to eat even one. That continued for the next day, and the next. Barrett didn't exactly remember how many days it was. All he remembered was that he woke up with Raina spooning soup into his mouth. At some point, he had passed out, though he didn't remember when. He didn't even have the energy to protest at the soup, and he really didn't want to. Instead, he quietly appreciated it. At dinner that evening, nobody said anything. However, Barrett's plate had all of the normal compliments of a meal, but no sprouts. The incident was never spoken of again, and meals returned to their normal cheer. Barrett knew he was behind on some of his studying, but he couldn't help it. Memorizing people was so boring. There was mostly a lot of names and titles, and even if there was a portrait or sketch it just made it a bit easier. He didn't really care about many of their accomplishments, and some of them really didn't have anything going for them except being born into a noble family. Sure, he had memorized the attractive young women first, but that came more easily. Besides, he would be married to one of them in the future. It would likely be a handful of years, but it would happen. He didn't want to make a bad impression on any of them if he could help it. After he thought about that, he supposed he should know their fathers, and mother, and brothers. If they had sisters, they were likely already on the list, but some were older and already married, and some were much younger and probably wouldn't be considered. Regardless, Barrett eventually got through all of the names and descriptions. He could have taken more time, but there were some social events upcoming. He was now old enough he would be expected to attend, and at 12 years old he was almost an adult, and would be expected to behave properly. It would be better if he knew who people were, to avoid making his father look bad. It would be best if people just remembered him as a nice young man, and not for any other reason. Barrett had little to do at the party. Even though it was on the Ravenhall estate, people weren't there to see him, but his parents, and other important people. Even so, there were many others around. Barrett went and introduced himself to some of the attractive young ladies, but that was all. He didn't have much to converse with them about, so he found himself drifting from group to group. He heard a group laughing around the corner, and though he would go see what they were up to. When he did, he didn't like what he saw at all. He saw a number of unfamiliar faces, but at least one of them fit a description for some of those he would prefer to avoid. He also recognized his cousin, Denton, who he was even more keen on avoiding. However, Raina was standing next to the group with her head down. One of the young men pointed to a puddle on the floor. Go ahead, clean it up. As she bent down to soak up the puddle with a rag, Denton poured a glass of wine over her head. Don't forget to clean yourself up as well. The group's laughter intensified. Barrett was not far from the group, and in only a few steps he found himself in front of Denton. Cousin, he stated flatly. He had planned to say something else, but instead found his fist connecting with Denton's face. Denton flew back onto his rear. Then, a brawl broke out. Nobody bothered to ascertain the reason, and fists were flying everywhere, though perhaps mostly at Barrett. He only hazily grasped what was happening. When the guards heard the commotion, what they found was a number of boys with bruised faces. However, at the moment Barrett himself was on top of Denton punching him as he flailed to fight back. It took 2 guards to drag Barrett off of him, only after which he passed out and it became clear that the most beaten and bloody was Barrett himself. He was sternly reprimanded by his father afterwards. Barrett was regretful, but it didn't become a big incident. The most injured were Barrett and Denton, and this wasn't the first scrap they had, though it was the biggest so far. Barrett felt bad for causing trouble, but when Reyna came to him later and muttered thanks, he felt everything was worth it. Though his face was swollen for a week and his bruised ribs took a few to recover, he could still smile. Chapter 3. Barrett sat in the carriage and watched the buildings go by. They were good buildings, and made up a good city. Durham was a good city, and his father had worked hard to make it that way, and his father before him, and so on. It was prosperous, and Barrett admired the many rich storefronts they were passing by. Even before they entered the next part of the city, Barrett could already see the spires of the cathedral. It was the largest and most impressive one even in the surrounding regions, second only to the one in the capital, Tennis. It was dedicated to Ristos, the god of prosperity. Barrett felt there was no more appropriate god to worship in their city. Barrett and his family stepped out of the carriage and entered the grand sanctuary. It was truly impressive the way light streamed through the colored glass. As always, the service was enheartening and delightful. Of course, they gave to the offering, the money would be distributed to those in need. Barrett was glad for such days. Not only because it provided a break from the constant studying, but because it was nice to be reminded of all the good in the world. It made him feel like nothing could go wrong. Barrett slept deeply, so it was with some surprise that he actually woke in the night. At first, he was disoriented. He couldn't make sense of the noise, and the light. Was it morning already? It didn't feel right. It only took him a few more moments to realize the sounds, the crackling of fire, and, had there been an explosion? He got up and ran to the window, and saw through the slats that one of the neighboring estates was on fire, and some of it had already collapsed. He could also see that the fire was not just limited to there. Even the east wing of the Ravenhall estate, and probably more, was on fire. There was no time to think, no time to dress in proper clothing. He quickly ran out of the room. He could smell the smoke now, feel the heat, and hear the crackle of the fire clearly. It seemed to be everywhere. He ran to one end of the hallway, and found the doorknob hot. Even so, he pulled open the door, only to be met by a wall of flames. He retreated, but then he heard a loud crack. By the time he looked up, it was too late. A support was falling, and he didn't even have time to think about getting out of the way before he was flat on his back with the wind knocked out of him. The only thing he could think of was that it was hot. That was to be expected, with a burning log on top of him, but even so the thought came to him. It took a few moments before the thought came to him to push it off, but when he tried to put strength in his arms they wouldn't move. His arms were fine, but with the wind knocked out of him and more weight on top, he wasn't functioning well. The coughing from the smoke wasn't helping either, especially since he was pretty sure that some of it was from his flesh searing. It smelled like that, though he could barely feel it. Barrett hazily waited to die. However, even as he thought about death, he heard a voice. Master. Young master. It was Reyna. The servants' rooms were on the first floor, which meant she had to have come through most of the house to get to him. He wanted to say something, but couldn't. Don't worry, young master, I'll get this off of you. Barrett heard some grunting noises, and then the weight was lifted off of him. He got a good breath for the first time in what felt like forever, but could have only been a few moments. At least the air down at floor level was mostly smoke-free. Reyna reached out to help Barrett stand up, but when he took her hand he saw her wince. He looked down at her hands which were charred black, then let go. He somehow pushed himself off the floor himself. He could stand, though running was out of the question. He started hobbling toward the other end of the hallway. They could still make it out. However, before he got far, Reyna stopped him. There is too much fire back that way. We won't make it. She went over to a window and started pushing and pulling on some of the wooden slats. It was a pitiful sight, and Barrett couldn't stand to see it happen. She tried not to grimace in pain, but he still saw it, if somewhat dimly in the flickering light. Barrett was regaining some control over his body, and started tearing off the slats one at a time. All of the exercise wasn't for nothing after all. The roof was crumbling, behind and around them. The heat was almost intolerable, but it seemed as if any sweat evaporated as soon as it appeared. After what felt like forever, the two had managed to remove the slats from the lower half of the window. Reyna jumped out first, landing heavily on the ground below and staggering to her knees. Barrett wasn't fond of heights, but he wasn't going to stay in a burning building. He jumped, and tried his best to control his impact to the ground. His legs felt like they would break, but they didn't. At least, he remained standing. Then, there was a further sound of an explosion, and a groaning sound. Barrett saw the whole wall of the house leaning, falling. As if in slow motion. The flames trailed behind it as it came down. Reyna was still crouched down. Barrett's body moved on its own, throwing her to the ground and himself over her as the wall and much of the nearby building came crashing down. He propped himself over her with his arms as debris crashed down all around them, and on him. What felt like an entire wall fell on him, but in a moment he realized it was only a small piece as the rest of it fell next. He felt his arms shatter, at least his forearms. His back was in great pain as well, but the pain was muted and unreal. Somehow, he ended up propped up on his elbows nearly face to face with Reyna, and somehow still conscious. The last thing he saw was a burning timber landing on her face as he collapsed into unconsciousness. Chapter 4. Pain. Pain was everywhere. Barrett couldn't even say what parts of him the pain was coming from. It just hurt. Then, he would blissfully fall unconscious again for what felt like a few brief moments. Then the pain returned. Barrett had no idea how long he drifted in and out of consciousness for, only that the pain never seemed to reduce. Finally, the pain consolidated itself into discrete forms. There was pain in his legs, and any time they moved he felt the burns shoot pain through his legs. However, that was the least of his problems. His back was much worse, and he was laying on that. It felt like he was still on fire, and the crackle of his skin reminded him of the crackle of the blazing inferno. His chest, it only had one part that ached. It was painful, but also carried with it a cold, heavy sensation. His arms had not been spared the pain of the fire, and he also felt great pain any time he tried to move them, or even wiggle his fingers. He would open his eyes and look at them, but it hurt to even try, and when he pushed through the pain to partly open one eye, all he saw was blackness. Perhaps not total blackness, as there was the slightest hint of light, but regardless he saw nothing useful, and felt he had caused quite a bit of harm. The rest of his head was not much better. Though he couldn't reach up his hand to feel it, there were certainly bandages everywhere. Barrett realized that the pain wasn't quite everywhere. There were certain places that were numb. However, somehow that felt even worse than the pain. When he moved his head, it ached even more, but he still did so. The bandages shifted ever so slightly, but there was none of the feeling of it rubbing against hair that Barrett expected. When he thought about it, it wasn't a surprise that hair wouldn't survive a fire. However, this thought made Barrett realize he had survived. Even if it didn't feel like it, he was definitely alive and conscious now. At least for brief periods. The sounds of a door creaking open filled his ears. At least those still worked, even though they hurt. Just like his lips and throat when he tried to move them to speak. "Oh, you're awake?" A woman's voice came to Barrett's ears, though it was muted. "Don't try to speak." The sound of footsteps coming closer followed that, and then there was a clinking sound. Soup. Then he felt a hand on his chin. It was gentle, but every sensation brought pain with it. However, he appreciated it, because he couldn't really move his jaw as he wanted himself. The soup poured into his mouth, thankfully cool. It had little taste, but that was probably for the best. Cool wasn't even quite the right word. Perhaps it was lukewarm soup, but at least it wasn't hot. Barrett didn't want anything hot. After a number of spoonfuls Barrett didn't count, he felt pleasantly full, though nothing else felt pleasant. That's all. Try to sleep. There was actually nothing else Barrett could do. Even though all he had been doing was sleeping, he was still exhausted. He drifted into unconsciousness again, this time for perhaps a bit longer. Over the next few days he had more soup. He couldn't even say what it was, just that it was only broth. Not that he could have chewed anything. He could barely move, though he gained a little bit movement with each day. Finally he managed to croak out some words. "Who are you? Where am I? Oh, you can speak. I'm Margaret. You're staying at the Ravenhall estate in Tri-Ridge." Barrett wanted to ask more, but he couldn't get out the words. At least he knew where he was. Not that it was much better than being out in a ditch somewhere. Actually, he thought he might prefer that. Denton lived in Tri-Ridge, which meant he was around here somewhere, and that made Barrett not want to be here. He couldn't go anywhere though, so there was nothing he could do about it. Thinking about that made him realize how long it had been. It had to have been at least a week or two since the fire for them to travel to Durham and back to Tri-Ridge, plus the time he had been conscious. It would likely be more. The next chance he got, he asked one more thing. "My parents? Are they?" The woman's voice came solemn and neutral. "You seem to be the only one who survived." Barrett was glad his face was covered in bandages. That way nobody could see him cry. Before, he would have cried for himself, but his eyes wouldn't do even that. Now, he had somewhat come to terms with the pain in his body, he hadn't been dealing with the pain in his heart. Although he hadn't known until now, he felt it. After all, otherwise why would he be here, and why would his parents not visit? Anne. Raina. Barrett was distraught about his parents and his sister, but Raina. She was the last thing he had seen before falling unconscious. Besides blackness, she was still the last thing he had seen, except muted little bits of light through the bandages. She had been right there in front of him. He thought he'd shielded her, but apparently it hadn't been enough. On the other hand, any number of things could have happened. Perhaps another section of wall, or the fire. Barrett didn't want to think about it. He couldn't stop thinking about it, but he tried not to. Margaret changed Barrett's bandages, and that gave him an opportunity to look at himself. He even convinced her to bring a small hand mirror. He regretted it after he looked, but he couldn't stop. His face didn't even look like his own. It was blackened, except parts of it were pitted. His hair was burnt off, and his ears were shriveled. He couldn't imagine what his back was like. His chest was less severe, except for one thing. Barrett had almost forgotten that he wore an amulet with his family's crest. It had been a constant thing. Now, that crest was melted and burned into his chest. The bits of metal were slightly melted and deformed, but definitely from that amulet. The skin had already started to grow over it and form a lumpy scar. Barrett wondered just how much he could recover. Even if he did, he would surely be deformed. Even though his face wasn't covered, he still cried for himself. Chapter 5. Over the next week, the only person Barrett saw was Margaret. His wounds healed some, enough that he could move his fingers, and even stand up, though changing positions still brought great pain. Even so, he felt it was less than before, though maybe the parts of his body that weren't already numb were just becoming that way. Barrett wished the pain of his family being lost had lessened, for he had far too much time to think about it. He tried to sleep as much as he could, but that was often interrupted by nightmares. Usually, they were of fire and flames, and pained looks on Raina's face before blackness overtook him. Barrett was awakened by the door opening. He was surprised he missed the sound of the knock, but in a few moments he realized it wasn't Margaret. It was Denton. Barrett was glad that his expression couldn't be seen, because he grimaced. That wasn't the appropriate response. "Ah, good, you're awake." Denton casually walked over next to the bed. "I have something to talk to you about. First, I must say something." Barrett steeled himself. He didn't really want to say it, but he had to. "Thank you for taking care of me." Denton sneered. "You owe us more than thanks. That's what I'm here about. We can't have you lying here pampered forever. There are expenses, you know." Barrett continued to be glad that the look of disgust on his face couldn't be seen under the bandages. He had been polite and proper, but his cousin still remained himself. This was pampered. He was nearly crippled and resting in bed, and not a good bed at that. This was a small room with inferior furnishings. Barrett knew Denton wouldn't be caught dead in sheets of rough cotton. Actually, that wasn't a bad idea. Barrett imagined strangling Denton with the bedsheets. "Expenses, you said?" "Of course. Bandages aren't free, nor is food. Of course, we also have to pay the servant taking care of you. Not to mention the medicinal salves. And? What are you suggesting? Get off your lazy ass and go get a job. Otherwise, we'll have to leave you to yourself at the end of next month." "I see." Barrett wanted to stand up and punch Denton in the face, but he couldn't do that. More importantly, it was unwise. If he did anything rash, he could be thrown out that very day, and he was still injured, and without any possessions. "We're only extending this courtesy because you are family. Remember, the end of next month." Denton turned on his heel and walked out at that. Barrett stared at the door. Courtesy. Real family would take care of him at no cost. No, they would take care of him no matter the expense. As for the food expenses, they must have been trivial. The food he got wasn't good by any means, though it was adequately filling. The bandages weren't good quality either. Once he could stand a bit better, he would go to the bank. Then he would throw some silvers at Denton and return to Durham. Perhaps there wasn't much left there, but the land was his. "Margaret, have I been treated with any medicinal salves?" She shook her head, her face neutral as always. "You have." "Why don't I remember that?" "You were merely unconscious at the time." Margaret turned to look at the door, then moved close to Barrett and whispered, "The mistress and the young master declared they were unnecessary. In reality, you have not." "I cannot go against the orders." Barrett nodded. He understood that she didn't have any real choice. He also considered the cost of medicinal salves in his head, and put that among the pool of various numbers that were floating around. A few days later, Barrett really couldn't walk, but he was doing it anyway. He didn't care that his body protested it had no energy, he couldn't stand the thought of remaining in his cousin's household any longer. For some reason, he came by every day to remind Barrett of his debts. Though he shouldn't really owe anything for a myriad of reasons, the idea still annoyed him. Thus, he shuffled his way down to the Bank of Tri-Ridge. Though the main accounts were in Durham, Barrett's family still had some funds accessible in other cities through various banks or branches. The Bank of Tri-Ridge was not, in fact, the only bank in the city, but it was by far the biggest. As expected of a bank, it was large, imposing, and quite ornate. A flight of stairs led up to the entrance. The doors were fine ebony, and flanked by armed guards. It was these very guards who stopped Barrett. "No beggars in the bank. Please leave the property." "I am no beggar. I am Barrett Ravenhall, a customer of the bank." The guards looked at each other, then one turned back to him. "I've never heard of a Barrett in the Ravenhall family. The only young man is a Denton, and you aren't him." He looked over Barrett's bandages, as well as the poor clothing he had on top of it. "Sorry, we can't let you in without some kind of proof." If Barrett had proof of his identity, he might have already come earlier, even if he had to drag himself. However, he didn't have his signet ring. He didn't wear it to bed, and wasn't worried about it as the house burned down around him. Perhaps he should have been. His pendant that was now part of his chest, wasn't proof by any means. It only barely looked like the crest now anyway. What's going on here? A corpulent banker walked up the stairs leading to the door, and he frowned at Barrett. "I'm Barrett Ravenhall, a customer at this bank. The guards didn't know me and wouldn't let me in." The banker sneered, "I'm sure you are. And I'm the young prince. Throw him off bank property." One of the guards immediately seized Barrett and dragged him down the stairs. Barrett couldn't walk fast enough to keep up, so he really was dragged, though at least not along the ground. The guard held him up by his bicep, which caused pain to shoot through his whole arm, but that was still probably better than thumping downstairs. For his part, the guard left him standing on his feet at the end of the stairs instead of literally throwing him. Barrett looked up the stairs at the building, and thought of the face of the corpulent banker. He didn't know his name, but he engraved the face into his memory. Chapter 6. Barrett didn't know where to go. He had a plan, and it failed. He wasn't going to give up, but there was no way the guards would let him in, and sneaking in would be foolish. However, he didn't have high hopes for other bankers helping him either. If he was a banker, would he have let himself in? Barrett thought he actually would, but he wasn't a banker, so maybe he wouldn't have. He wasn't even dirty, just in poor clothes and bandages. Still, the banker didn't even listen when he mentioned he had legitimate business. Barrett was a better person than that, wasn't he? He wasn't going to go back to the manor right away. Every moment spent there increased his chances of meeting his cousin or his aunt. Even though they were keeping a roof over his head, he could barely remain cordial with them. Or perhaps it was the way his cousin dangled the roof over his head and threatened to drop it on him. That comparison didn't help him appreciate it more, due to recent experiences. Barrett wandered blindly for some time before he found himself in front of another grand building. It was a cathedral to Ristos. Barrett thought he could use some prosperity in his life, and even if this cathedral was somewhat less grand than the one in Durham, that was what it should offer. It was just the right time for the service, even, perhaps a bit late. However, he once again found his path barred. No entry. The guard stood in the way, expressionless. Is this not a church of Ristos? Should it not be open to everyone? The God of prosperity welcomes all. Handouts are tomorrow morning. Come back then. The guard remained standing in his way. Barrett took time to politely leave. He got the message. He went back to walking the streets, and wondered to himself. Was the world always like this? He was treated like a stray dog just because he had bandages and poor clothes. No, Durham was better. His father managed Durham, so it was certainly, at least, a little bit better. Wasn't it? It was only a short while more before Barrett realized something. He shouldn't be walking. He probably shouldn't have gone all the way to the bank, but he definitely shouldn't have gone far afterwards. Unfortunately, it took until his legs gave out to realize this. He managed to drag himself off to the side of the road and lean up against a building. He watched people walk by and the people ignored him. It was as if he wasn't there at all, but invisible. He looked down at his own hands to make sure he could see them, and saw bandages. Those were quite visible, at least. It was a cool day, which might have been pleasant if Barrett had decent clothing. As it was, his thin clothes did nothing, and the bandages did little more than that. He shivered, but he couldn't stand up to get inside, and doubted most places would take him. A tavern might, but only until they realized he had no coin. Not that he knew where one was or could get to it. At this time of day, perhaps a bistro might be more appropriate, but the same points remained. Barrett's vision glazed over as he looked out at those passing by. Nothing was interesting enough for him to actually focus on, so he just saw the legs passing by, those of humans and of horses. When his vision was blocked, it took him several moments to realize there was someone crouching in front of him. It was a scruffy-looking man, a pauper, barely better off than Barrett himself looked. When the man spoke, Barrett's eyes focused on him. "Hello, friend. Do you need a meal?" Barrett was indeed hungry, but he wouldn't resort to begging. His stomach betrayed him, however, grumbling, "I'll take that as a yes. Let's get you inside, and in a chair, even." The man didn't wait for an answer, but lifted Barrett to his feet. Barrett expected pain, but the man had chosen the one part of him that didn't hurt, his armpits. At least, they didn't hurt much. The man saw that Barrett couldn't stand on his own feet, and supported Barrett, walking along the street. Barrett didn't have the strength or will to resist. He could have said something, but the thought of food was nice, and he had no reason to refuse. As for thinking the situation was odd, it truly seemed so, but it wasn't like he could be robbed. He had nothing on him worth taking. Even his shoes were so poorly made as to have no value, which made him wonder how the Ravenhalls even got them. That must have taken special effort. It wasn't long before Barrett found himself inside a house. That was unexpected, really. There were 7 others in the house already, sitting around a table that didn't have room for all of them, let alone 2 more. Somehow, though, Barrett found that everyone ended up sitting there. A slightly rotund man sat at the head of the table, though he wasn't quite aligned correctly to accommodate the chairs crowding around. "Welcome, everyone. It's good to see some new faces." He nodded to Barrett and one other. "God, please bless this meal to keep us healthy." That was the shortest prayer Barrett had ever heard, so much that he nearly missed it. It didn't bother him, though, because that meant the food came even faster. There was the smell of fresh warm bread. A woman, presumably the rotund man's wife, brought the bread in a pot of soup, and then they managed to squeeze yet one more space around the table, and everyone started eating. Barrett wasn't sure exactly why he was here, but he found that the simple bread and soup filled Barrett quite well. Even though they were simple, the taste was good, which made him realize how much the food he had been given at his cousin's manor had been downgraded, to actually be as it had been. He'd thought maybe he'd lost some of his sense of taste, but instead the food had really been that bland. That thought went on the list, though it soon faded into obscurity as the good food overwhelmed his thoughts. Then, a boisterous conversation began. Chapter 7. Barrett soon learned that many of those at the meal were not any better off than him. Most of their clothes were similarly of poor quality, and there was even one person who had bandages covering some sores. Only the host and his wife looked slightly better off. As for Barrett, though he was given very little, at least he could count on the roof over his head being secure. As he took in the sounds of eating a meal, Barrett wondered why he had been invited. Had he just looked so pathetic that he was invited out of pity? Perhaps, but if so, it was a sort of pity filled with kindness. Barrett hadn't realized how much he had needed this. Not a place with real chairs, or decent food, but other people. Friendly conversation. He had been holed up in his room for weeks with only Margaret for company, and she didn't really make for friendly conversation. Barrett didn't say much himself. After all, he didn't want to talk about his own family. He merely casually mentioned being rejected from the Church of Ristos and that he was looking for work. He hadn't really thought about it, but he had to get work of some kind. He couldn't access his money, and working was the only other way to get it. At least, that he would consider. He didn't want to beg, and stealing was out of the question. Finally everyone was finished eating and the talking was dying down. The host, Simon, spoke up. "I would like to end today's meal with a simple prayer to God. May He shower mercy and blessings on all of us." The following prayer felt more like a conversation with a friend than what Barrett was used to, but it was comforting, even if he wasn't sure how he felt about gods at the moment. "What did you say your God's name was? What is his domain?" Barrett asked. "He's just God. Sometimes called the Nameless God. He doesn't limit himself to any specific domain. If he's called the Nameless God, isn't that a name?" Simon shrugged. "Does it matter, really? It's not the point. At the very least it is a distinguishing factor. He's not the same type of thing as Ristos." "Ah. Simon shook his head. None of us here are welcomed in such a church. After all, how can the unprosperous attend a church of prosperity? As for this little meeting. His eyes focused on Barrett. I doubt you give one whit about my God. It doesn't matter. You are still welcome here. Usually, we have one lunch a week. Simon shrugged. I have not the extra money for more. Sometimes, we will meet elsewhere. Perhaps I will see you next week. Barrett hesitated, then nodded. If you would have me. I should go now. Seeking jobs. Simon sighed, his face falling. I wish blessings upon you in your endeavors, but I think you will find the task most difficult. Good day, Barrett. Barrett found that outside had warmed up considerably. At least, most of the chill was gone. He wondered where he should start first. Who always needed more work? Barrett stopped for a moment. He didn't remember telling Simon his name. Then he shook his head. It didn't matter for now. The first establishment Barrett found was a blacksmith. He knew that was decent work for young men. Though he wasn't in good shape, he was recovering, so he decided to inquire inside. The blacksmith looked him over with a frown. How much experience do you have, young lad? None, but I could help clean the forged, or press the bellows, or man the counter. I know arithmetic. The blacksmith's eyes seemed to light up briefly, then he shook his head. Sorry, we're not looking for anyone. I have enough help around here. Barrett sighed. He wished he could offer to work for free, to get some proper learning, but he was doing this because he needed money, not just experience. The next stop was a grocer. However, his time there was even shorter. What are you, diseased? Out, out. He was shuffled out the door without even a chance to explain. Well, he had seen an assistant there anyway. Barrett thought about what he could actually do. He knew arithmetic, reading, those were useful in some jobs. Optimally, he would be a banker's assistant, but he could imagine how that would go. Well, he would think about trying later. Then he came upon an inn. The first thing that boosted his confidence was that there was a sign indicating that they were hiring. He entered, finding a person he presumed to be the innkeeper facing away from him at the counter. I hear you're hiring. I can read and write and do arithmetic. Really? That's great. The man turned around with a smile on his face. We're actually looking for then his face fell. Ah, that is to say, we've actually just filled up the position. Sorry. The man was a terrible liar. Is it my face? The bandages? I could do accounts in the back. I wouldn't bother the customers. No, we're simply adequately staffed now. The man tried to smile, but couldn't. Perhaps you can find work somewhere else. He didn't sound confident about that idea. Oh. Thank you for your time. Barrett frowned. That reaction was strange. The man had seemed to be about to hire him on the spot with the initial enthusiasm, until he saw Barrett. Even so, he believed it wasn't related to him being covered in bandages, or that was the only believable lie that the innkeeper said. Barrett wanted to try a few more places, but his legs were quite tired already. He would go back to the manor and think about things. He didn't want to jump to any conclusions, but he had a list that was getting filled out with quite a bit more things than he wanted, and it could suddenly be filled with more. Chapter 8. The first thing Barrett heard upon entering the manor was Denton's annoying voice. Perhaps some might find it pleasant, but in that case it would have to speak pleasant words. Do you have what you owe us yet, cousin? Barrett was glad that his face was covered in bandages, because his glare wouldn't have been good for his situation. As it was, he probably paused for too long before speaking. Not yet. I was looking for employment, but I found the situation to be a bit more difficult than anticipated. How unfortunate, Denton grinned, but in these trying economic times, nobody can afford to hire more help. I also stopped by the bank, but they wouldn't even let me in. Denton shrugged, there's not much that can be done about that. We can't force them to verify your identity. We don't run the bank. Denton's smile grew even more unpleasant. If you still can't find any work by the end of the week, I suppose we could take pity and hire you as a servant here. It's the least we could do. Barrett agreed. That was absolutely the very least they could do. Several days passed. Barrett found each day he could walk a little more easily, and visit more places. However, absolutely everywhere he went, nobody was hiring. At least, they weren't hiring him. There were a few places that had signs indicating they were hiring. Some of those rejected Barrett on the basis of his lack of qualifications for the positions. He could accept that, if grudgingly. The others, they seemed to be mysteriously not hiring anymore. Even more strangely, the blacksmith and Barrett had already visited seemed to have acquired a new hire and a receptionist respectively, but not for several days after he visited. Barrett fared no better at the bank. Even when there were different guards they had orders not to let him in. Just in case, Barrett managed to be there when several different bankers arrived, and they had him literally thrown off the property instead of merely dragged away. Many faces went onto the list. Barrett was not stupid. He would admit that he was perhaps a bit naive, but he was not unintelligent. The shift eyes of people he asked for work, their enthusiasm to hire followed by sudden disinterest, and even his cousin's words themselves. It wasn't that people didn't want to hire, but they didn't want to hire him. A portion of the establishment simply wouldn't consider him because of look, but the rest would have gladly accepted an educated hire, even if they weren't trained for the specific job. They couldn't hire him though. Nobody said it directly, but there were one or two who hinted at it, but seemed afraid to say more. Barrett's relatives controlled the city, and they seemed to have a pretty firm grip over it as well. The bank also appeared to be deeply connected. If he was in Durham, Barrett knew people. There was no way the bank would have denied him his money, and he could easily get help from any number of other people. If he could even get a letter to them, but he supposed even his cousin would have considered that. He had no money, and couldn't have trusted anyone with the letter anyway. Still, it wouldn't hurt too much to try, if he had the money. Barrett considered ways to get money. Legitimate means wouldn't work, so the only real option seemed to be to steal some. Perhaps that was what they wanted though. If Barrett actually stole something, his cousin and aunt would have all the excuse they needed to get him in trouble. Plus, even though they had an overabundance of wealth, stealing from them or others was still wrong. Even if the money wasn't all obtained legitimately, there were still certain ways things had to be done. Barrett wished he hadn't been ingrained with morals from a young age, but that was just the way things were. At the very least, things weren't quite bad enough for that yet. That left the option of becoming a servant to his cousin Denton and his Aunt Melody. That was a shameful proposition, but no matter how unpleasant it was, feeling shame was not wrong. It was somewhat shameful for a noble to be a servant, but it was much more shameful for Barrett to be a servant to them. Barrett didn't think for even a second that they would be easy on him, or even particularly fair. However, the other option seemed to be, to become a criminal or leave the city. Barrett briefly considered another option. The kind fellow who provided lunch, he might take him in. Barrett quickly dismissed that. It would only put a burden on one of the few good people, and he might be implicated in whatever scheme there was against Barrett. Besides, kind as he was, would he even provide additional help to someone he'd met just once? Barrett knew he wouldn't last more than a day or two on the streets or outside the city, if he could even leave the city. If only he was in Durham still, but he wasn't. Perhaps that was part of the plan. Barrett thought about it. How did he get here anyway? He was unconscious, to be sure, but it was a long trip. He couldn't have survived just lying around for the days it would for news to travel from Durham to Tryridge, let alone the trip from Tryridge to Durham and back. Besides, he now knew the date, and he had not been unconscious long enough for that. In fact, he must have been taken from Durham to Tryridge almost immediately after the fire. That didn't say anything good about the situation, since he hadn't known of Denton or Melody being in town. The wilderness was starting to look like a good idea, but Barrett's body was still weak. He wouldn't get far, even if he had food and some sort of real clothing and perhaps a tent. He couldn't imagine a worse situation, except maybe his parents were alive. Maybe he had just been kidnapped. Except, it was hard to suppress actual news throughout a city. Many people had talked about the fire, and how it had killed everyone. That was when Barrett realized, he was already dead. At least, from the world's perspective. Chapter 9. Barrett spent several more days pointlessly attempting to find work of some sort, not with any real hope, but just because he didn't want to admit defeat. However, he finally had to accept it, no matter how much he hated the idea of being subordinate to Denton and Melody. Delaying any further would only increase his debt, unfair as it was. He couldn't think of anything he could do in Tryridge, nor could he think of a way to leave. He knew the guards wouldn't just let him out of the city, and he didn't have any way to disguise himself or survive in the wild regardless. At least accepting the position as servant would give him time to think. The head servant was named Albert, and he smiled too much. It was a patently false smile that never seemed to disappear, like someone had carved it into his face. Barrett thought it would be hard to talk with a face like that, but he managed it just fine. Now then, since you don't seem to have any skills, we'll have to train you from the ground up. The first lesson is that you must respond to everything with a, yes, master, yes, mistress, or in the case of me, yes, sir. Barrett barely even had any time to think before a slap hit his face. Where's my, yes, sir? It had only been a moment, and it seemed like Albert was still talking, so he hadn't wanted to interrupt, but he knew that it was better not to say that. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. He added another name and face to the list, and started keeping record of more new things. The first week was very frustrating. Denton took every opportunity to order Barrett round for trivial things, and add insults wherever he could. Pick that up for me. Go get me tea. Clean up this mess. Too slow, are you stupid? You can't even do a servant's work. Barrett was also expected to take care of various cleaning duties. Though Albert said he needed to be trained to do everything, there was actually no training involved. He was just told what to do, and not where to find the tools necessary to accomplish the tasks, or what was really involved. The only thing that kept him sane was Margaret, who would occasionally speak a few words as she walked by. Dust rags are in the storage building behind the manor, or talking about how some types of wood needed special soap and then a rub of a certain oil to make sure they didn't tarnish. Albert looked upset that Barrett was performing as well as he was, but he didn't deny him the use of the proper materials, even if he wouldn't tell him they were needed and was watching for mistakes. Barrett returned to Simon's house at the end of the week. It was the one place he could get a nice and comfortable meal, even with all of the crowding around the table. Barrett noticed a few different faces the second week, but everyone obviously needed the food, and the company. Barrett clutched his face. He was unfortunately now used to being slapped for his mistakes such as being slightly too slow, but he had just been punched. Fortunately he still wore bandages over his face, so that Denton couldn't see the anger he felt. He couldn't help but think of the possibility of strangling him in his sleep, ignoring the consequences. Barrett stared at the single silver coin he had received for wages. Of course, he should have been paid much more. However, he had to cover his former debts, and then there were the costs for a place to stay and food, and deductions because of his mistakes. At least, that was what he was told when he received the insubstantial pay. Barrett knew full well that live-in servants received their wages on top of room and board, at least at the price he was theoretically getting paid. There was also the fact that any mistakes he made now were caused by others. Denton seemed to delight in tripping him as he walked by, only to make clean up whatever mess was caused, and then chastising him for not fulfilling his other duties. Barrett knew that things would be much worse if he didn't fulfill those duties, so he had to stay up later and get up earlier than the other servants. Speaking of the other servants, some of them caused him trouble on purpose as well, feats that Albert looked on with approval. Barrett had a good memory, and when he tried, he was good at remembering names, faces, and events. Everything went on the list. Every meal at Simon's place came with a message. Talk of the way the world ought to be, the way people ought to behave, as well as an admission that neither of those things were how things were nor how people behaved. The Church of Ristos gave food to the hungry and money to widows, and even sponsored an orphanage, but for all their talk of charity, it was their own coffers that filled most of all. Barrett wanted to think it had been better in Durham, but he couldn't be sure. Though Simon was too humble to say it, Barrett knew that true charity was giving to those who needed, even when one had very little. Simon's house, while suitable enough, had no adornments. Most of the chairs didn't match, and soon another room was taken over with a table and more chairs for people to crowd around, leaving only the small kitchen and a likely tiny bedroom for the use of Simon and his wife. Barrett needed to buy bandages. That was a painful fact, because his money was already stretched very thin. He could really have used it to get a bit more nourishing food. That would have been preferable, but the bruises and scrapes were getting worse, and he honestly couldn't stand seeing his hands, or a reflection of his face. He now had 2 silver pieces, and with that he could get a few rolls of bandages. Ironically, they would be better than the ones he had been given, which was just a small comfort. Alms. Alms for the poor. Barrett sighed. Another beggar. It wasn't that he didn't feel for them, but rather there were too many of them, and he had so little to give. There were some beggars who were merely lazy, but most of them truly had no other way. As bad as he had it, Barrett wasn't the worst off. He didn't want to see any more of it, but he turned to look anyway. Vote for which series you would like to see continued, poll. Check the blog post for more info, Chapter 10. Upon looking at the beggar, Barrett immediately regretted it. He was an emaciated man, so thin that Barrett could count his ribs through his barely substantial clothing. Worse yet, he saw that one leg of his pants was tied off just above the knee. He was the most unfortunate sort. Barrett knew he wouldn't even be able to get a place in line for handouts at the Church of Ristos. Damn, there goes my bandages, he muttered to himself. Nobody but Barrett even glanced down at the beggar. When Barrett crouched near him, it was like they were invisible to the world. He held out his 2 silver coins and placed them in the beggar's hand. He could barely even hold on to them. Oh, thank you, kind sir, thank you. He bowed his head, as much as he could. Barrett thought he should have perhaps kept one of the silvers. After all, they could buy this man food for a week or 2, but it might be the last week or two of his life. If you can, make your way to the residential district at the end of the week. No, perhaps it would be better if you told me somewhere I might find you. I can take you for a meal. Simon wouldn't mind one more. In fact, he would be happy. The beggar nodded. I'll probably be in that alley over there. Barrett nodded and stood up. I hope to see you then. He turned to leave, but the beggar's voice came up from behind him. Ah, wait, young man. Barrett turned around and saw him digging through the remains of his shirt, in which there seemed to be a small pocket. I heard something about bandages. The beggar smiled an almost toothless grin, and held a small roll of bandages out on his hand. I happen to have some spares here. I don't think I'll need it anymore. He stretched his arm out as far as it would go. Take it. Barrett gingerly plucked the bandages from his hand. Thank you. He wouldn't reject the gift, and he did need bandages anyway. He tried not to think about the fact that they might be the only ones the beggar had, for emergencies. Barrett looked down at his hand. If nothing else, the bandages were good. They were soft and not abrasive, which was rather new. They also had just the right amount of stretch and yet tautness, easy to tie off, yet also simple to untie. Barrett only wished he didn't need them. His injuries from the fire had healed, at least as much as they ever would. The horrible scars would surely stay as reminders. Unfortunately, he was accruing new injuries. Though he got better at his job as a servant, the beatings grew worse for small or even non-existent infractions. Barrett couldn't help but think he was at fault. Not for failing at his job. His performance was more than adequate. No, instead it was that he wasn't strong enough or brave enough. He didn't have the courage to fight back, or to strangle someone in the night. He didn't have the strength to retaliate, or to take down even a single guard, let alone the rest around the manor or the city guards. Perhaps he couldn't. Yet, he also didn't have the courage to run. He was afraid of the wilderness. Would it be worse than where he was? He didn't know, but that was the problem. Of course, Barrett never forgot who the real blame fell on. Denton and Melody. Albert, the servants and guards of the manor, excepting Margaret, they were all to blame. Not to mention the bankers who wouldn't even consider giving him what belonged to him. There was no way they didn't know, they had to have been influenced by his family. Yet, even with all those people being responsible, Barrett still couldn't help but wonder how things would be different if he had power here. He had no connections, and wouldn't be able to make them, but could he be personally strong? Barrett tried to do the exercises he had started for sword training, but he didn't have any energy for it. He wasn't given enough food. Enough to survive, but not enough to grow. He couldn't even buy more now, since even more excuses were being made to dock his pay. He didn't know if he could make it even another week without going crazy, except he had received a small glimmer of hope. There was going to be a recruitment drive in a few months. This wasn't just for the army either, but even better. It was a combination of various mages, warriors, fencers, knights, healers. Those who were strong. Barrett didn't know how strong, but he knew Robert was strong enough to fight at least a dozen regular soldiers. If he could join any of them, it would change his life. He just had to make it until then. Barrett held his wrist gingerly. It was probably broken. Even moving his fingers made it hurt. He didn't have much to use as a splint, but he took what he could and then wrapped bandages around it tightly. He looked at the roll, and it appeared the same size as always. It was hard to believe, but it seemed he had magical bandages. The roll never seemed to run out. He didn't really know how it worked, but he wasn't going to complain. He thought of the beggar who had given them to him. Had he known? There was no way to find out. Barrett had gone to find him to bring him to the meal, but he wasn't there. He also had never shown up at Simon's place. That made Barrett think the worst had probably happened. Barrett was often up late. He had to finish his work, after all, because otherwise he would be punished in a manner that was almost justifiable. Likewise, he had also learned to move quietly, because people didn't like being woken up at night. On this particular night, that served him quite well. Barrett didn't go out of his way to spy, but he didn't particularly value the privacy of those who treated him worse than a pile of dirt. Thus, he had no problem listening in on the conversation in his aunt's study. He heard both Melody and Denton talking, and he didn't like what he heard at all. Chapter 11. Denton and Melody's voices traveled clearly through the door. They had no need to be quiet, because nobody would be around to hear them. They also had no qualms about their talking waking anyone, because they didn't care. Everything is under control. Melody's voice was heard first. That's excellent. Denton responded enthusiastically. I know you're having fun, but we can't afford to have him around any longer. You know what to do. There was a sigh. Of course, Mother. The sound of footsteps sent Barrett hiding away from the door, and Denton walked out and down the hallway. Barrett knew he couldn't wait any longer. He didn't like the sound of what he had heard. It might not be as bad as it sounded, but he couldn't risk it. The question was, what would he do? He actually had some plans. He thought about going into the office and strangling Melody. That would be cathartic, but it would throw off his other plans. Many things could go wrong, and he wasn't sure if she quite deserved that. Besides, murder would make him into a true criminal, and he didn't like that thought. Though he had a number of plans, there was only one that was feasible at the moment. He thought of all kinds of chaos he could cause as he left, but he didn't have time for that. There was no point in doing something so juvenile as leaving horse dung in Arthur's bed, for example, no matter how much he deserved that and much more. Barrett would have liked to at least give Denton a good swift kick in the balls as he left, but he thought subtlety was the best approach. Not that Barrett was just going to leave without any sort of revenge. After all, they had to at least pay the interest on what they owed him. He waited until Melody left her office. Then he snuck inside. In one of the lower drawers was a secret compartment. That was where the key was. Then, behind a bookshelf was a small room, in which was a safe. He discovered that by accident one time he had to stay up late working. Upon opening it, Barrett found there was not much. Not that he expected otherwise. After all, any real money was probably in the bank, like any sensible person with wealth. However, there was still a small pile of coins. Instead of just grabbing it all, Barrett actually counted out a certain amount. He just couldn't be a thief. This was what he was owed. That is, proper wages for a servant, plus the housing and food he shouldn't have been paying for, and of course all the deductions. Finally, he took an extra few coins as interest. The safe didn't only have coins, of course. Some of Melody's best jewelry was in there, as well as some important papers. Barrett wasted no time in ripping up the papers and even snapped a few necklaces out of spite. However, he didn't have time to do much more. He wished he had a dead rat to throw in, but he had no time for that. He merely closed the safe, and locked it. Then he went to get a heavy bookend. That was the best thing. He swung, but the angle wasn't quite right. The second time, he succeeded in snapping off the head of the key with the rest still in the lock. It was petty, but that was all he had time for now. Barrett had spent enough time around the mansion to know where the guards would be patrolling outside, so he managed to avoid them rather easily. He imagined burning the house down behind him, until it made him almost vomit just from the idea. Instead, he just slipped off into the night. Barrett found himself knocking on Simon's door. Where else could he go? He wouldn't be able to get out of the city at this time of night. He didn't like the idea of waiting until people were actually looking for him either, but he couldn't eat coins either. There was nowhere else Barrett could go but here. After a minute or so a voice came from behind the door. Who is it? It's me, Barrett. I need a place to stay. The door creaked open. Come in, then. Barrett only caught a glimpse of Simon's face as he entered into the room. It looked tired, but that was to be expected. Sorry about coming at this time. I need a place to stay, for a few days. Did you do anything wrong? Well, people will be looking for me. I don't want to cause trouble for you. I can find somewhere else. Barrett thought he saw Simon's head shake. It doesn't matter if people are looking for you. Did you do anything wrong? No. I didn't. Then, it's fine. You can stay here. We'll keep you hidden. Thank you. That night, Barrett slept on the hard floor with only a blanket. It was his best night of rest in months. Barrett looked down at his new clothes. They weren't great, but they covered him adequately, and were better than what he'd had. Simon had bought them for him, but of course Barrett had paid for them. He just couldn't go out to get them himself. Though, he would be going out today. The recruitment event had started. Barrett was going to go there to take his chances. If nothing worked, well, it was outside the city, so he could just leave. He had some supplies in a small sack, enough to get him to the next city at least. The only problem was leaving this one. It's better if you take the bandages off your face, Simon said. Barrett didn't want to reveal his scarred face. That didn't look like him anymore. They'll be looking for someone wrapped in bandages, correct? With different clothes they won't spend so long on your face. They might still find out it's me. Barrett slowly unwrapped the bandages. See? Simon looked intently at Barrett's face. It's not as bad as I thought. I know some others with scarred faces. It will be a simple favor to have them walk out the gates. That should help numb the guards' perceptions, and I can raise a bit of a distraction. Thank you. I don't know how to pay you back properly. He reached into his pouch and pulled out some coins. I can give you this, though. For all the wonderful meals. Simon shook his head. Those were gifts, a gesture of kindness. I can't take money for it. Then, take it so you can continue to afford to show kindness to others. They need people like you. Simon nodded. That, I can do. Chapter 12. Barrett found that he just walked right out of the city. He didn't even know if he needed Simon's distractions or not. There were so many people, and the guards only did cursory checks. They barely even glanced at him as he went past. Was a change of clothes and just not looking like what they expected really enough? There was nobody to ask about that. Simon was still inside the gate, and Barrett waved goodbye to him. Barrett didn't know how to thank him. He'd heard the soldiers going through the city, asking about him. They didn't quite raid houses, but they certainly combed the city for him. They even offered a reward for information leading to his capture, as if he were some sort of mass-murdering bandit. It was a very generous reward as well. However, Simon and his wife kept him safe, and didn't even seem slightly tempted. There were a large number of accusations made against him, but they took his word. Of course, all the crimes he was accused of were false, but even so he was grateful that they trusted him. They were good people, and remained that way, which seemed rare enough. Barrett thought he would have to think of some way to pay them back in the future. Money was no good, since no amount of money could compare to the help and kindness they gave. On the other hand, what else could he give? They didn't really need anything. Still, he added their names to a much smaller and nicer list than his other one. Barrett was overwhelmed by what he saw at the recruitment event. There was a large variety of people, both those recruiting and those hoping to be chosen. Each group had a certain area assigned to them. At the edge of the event were archers, because they needed more space to display their skills. Barrett saw someone hit the bullseye of a target from 100 meters. He thought it was an impressive display, and the person who did it also seemed to think that, but the recruiter just shook their head. Then, they moved to a position twice as far from the target. In one smooth motion they pulled an arrow from their quiver, pulled it back, and fired. The arrow flew through the air, not straight, but almost as if it were wandering back and forth. Yet, it still ended up at its target. Not just the bullseye, but splitting the arrow. Was that even possible? Barrett had seen soldiers try such a feat from a lesser distance, and the first arrow always deflected the second. Besides, they were usually not sharp enough to do so, and the arrow fired here was no different. The mages and wizards and other magical people were even more astounding. Barrett didn't know much about magic. He only knew his bandages were magical because there was no other way to have a roll that never ran out. That had to be magic. The bandages probably had a limit, they just hadn't reached it yet, and kept their appearance. They were still amazing, and practical, but not flashy. The magic users for the recruitment drive were definitely flashy. Their tents glowed, and some of them floated off the ground. They demonstrated fireballs, and lightning. Some even made illusions of giant beasts. Not that they felt like illusions when they roared and swung their claws at people. Barrett was glad he wasn't one of those standing up close. The various types of warriors were also impressive in their own way, swinging around giant weapons, crushing boulders. Some had skin that couldn't be pierced by weapons, and there were sparring matches that made the ground tremble. Barrett appreciated their straightforwardness. He could understand what they were doing, even if he wasn't nearly strong enough to do it himself. If he had been, things would have been different. Barrett toured around the whole event, taking in everything. It took several hours just to see the whole thing, and read the name of every group. He could tell that some of the groups were more prestigious than others. Their recruiters were more impressive, and they had many people clamoring to join them. Barrett wasn't sure what to try first. He wasn't going to overestimate himself and say he had a chance to get into something top quality, but he supposed that depended on their criteria. He certainly didn't have large amounts of muscle. Then, Barrett noticed one last place. He'd thought it was an empty lot between two tents, but it turned out to not be the case. Instead, taking the place of a large tent or sparring field, there was a single table and chair. At the table was a large man, rippling with muscle, though compared to some Barrett had seen, he actually looked almost skinny. He was leaning back in the chair, hands behind his head, feet up on the table, eyes closed like he was napping. A wooden sign leaned up against the table, with the words, Immortal Berserker Sect, scrawled on it. It was odd, and made the whole thing stand out. Crowds of people were standing around, lining up to try out for the groups on either side, but everyone seemed to ignore the man at the table. Barrett had some ideas about what that meant, but he couldn't be sure. Regardless, he was intrigued. Barrett walked up to the table. The Immortal Berserker Sect. Can I join? The man lazily opened one eye. Why? Because I want to be strong, so that nobody can tell me what to do. The man's eye looked up and down over Barrett. Nope. Not good enough. Then he closed his eye, and went back to his relaxed state. Not good enough. Why? Barrett got no response. If you tell me what isn't good enough, I can improve. Isn't that the point of a teacher? If the people you got here were good enough, they wouldn't need to join. Still no response came. Short of prying the man's eyes open, Barrett didn't know how to get his attention. He wasn't going to try that, as the man was much bigger than him, and more importantly it wouldn't leave a good impression anyway. Barrett sighed. He felt he had just missed one of the best opportunities. A sect with no competition, yet strong. They should have been strong. On the other hand, maybe Barrett's instincts were wrong. Well, he could always try another place, even if he wasn't filled with confidence in standing out enough to be selected. Chapter 13. Barrett tried some of the nearby places recruiting warriors. At the first two, he was immediately rejected with a glance. Another three, he waited in a long line of people before that rejection happened almost arbitrarily. It was finally at the sixth place that he actually got a chance. The large man there was very polite, and did his best to hide his doubt that Barrett could pass the test of strength they had. There were a few options. He could lift a rock, perhaps almost a boulder, but only barely large enough for that. The other option was to knock down a statue. Barrett started with the boulder. He had been made to carry many heavy things as a servant, often for no reason. Not a boulder though. Still, Barrett crouched down. He had learned a bit about how to make such a job easier. The boulder wasn't just a rock, it at least was shaped so that it had some places to grip below it. Barrett tried to lift, but just didn't have the strength. He was hoping the boulder was lighter than it looked, but if anything it was heavier. He couldn't even shift it along the ground. That left the statue. It was big and made of stone, but he just had to knock it over. That was easier than lifting it. However, Barrett struggled with it for a few minutes before giving up. He knew there must have been some trick to it, but he couldn't figure it out. Of course, if he was much stronger, he could have just tackled it and knocked it over, but it was quite stable, and all he ended up doing was hurting himself. The examiner just shook his head, but at least he had let Barrett try. The other places were no better. Barrett felt that a sword was light, until he tried to swing it, and he didn't know enough to have proper form, and certainly not to cut through the targets. He thought perhaps archery would be better, but he underestimated how much strength it took to pull back the bowstring. He had already observed that most of those who passed had their own bows anyway, but at least he got to use one for a test. His first arrow didn't reach the target, but once he put in all of his effort the next one flew far enough, though off to the side, and the third actually hit the target, but only barely. Of course, that wasn't good enough to pass. Barrett was disappointed, but he realized it was natural. After all, most of the tests were designed for those with some training, or at least for fully grown men or older teens. Here he was, 13 years old, he'd actually forgotten that had happened, since his birthday happened while he was at his cousin and aunt's house. Obviously, they hadn't celebrated. So, Barrett thought his performance wasn't as poor as it seemed, but still not good enough. His injuries hadn't helped his strength either, and his body still felt weaker than when he had regularly practiced sparring, but those hadn't even been with real weapons. Barrett still went to every single place. He continued to be rejected, and just became exhausted. He set aside time to rest between each. It took him more than a day to try all of the warriors. Then, he moved on to swashbucklers. He didn't know what a swash was and why it had buckles, but regardless these people practiced more finesse-based techniques. They used daggers and other light weapons, focusing on speed. What frustrated Barrett in those areas was that he almost passed some of the tests, to just barely fail. Actually, he thought he'd passed one of them, and the examiner just hadn't liked him, maybe because he was wrapped in bandages. Of course, some had extremely high standards and he didn't even know where to start. He certainly couldn't throw a needle through a series of ever smaller hoops, let alone one with each hand at the same time. Then, there were the wizards, and the rest who did magic. Barrett had no idea how magic worked, but he still showed up and attempted every test he was allowed to. Unfortunately, most of them wanted him to use a basic form of magic, and he had no idea how to. Nobody had taught him, and nobody here seemed interested in telling him. Barrett avoided the areas with the pyromancers until very last. However, they were really his last hope. Of course, most of them he was rejected purely on the basis of not knowing any of what they had to teach already. He finally found one place. They had some sort of magical object that could apparently test affinity for pyromancy. It was a small furnace, and he was supposed to stare into it and try to bend it to his will. Apparently it would enhance the effects of such magic, so anyone with the talent could do it. Barrett sat cross-legged in front of it. That was already hard. He heard it crackling and felt the heat. He swallowed, and focused his eyes on it. He willed the fire to move as he wished, to gather into a ball, to do anything. However, the more he focused on the fire, the more he remembered. The heat, the pain. Raina's face. He relived the fire at his family home over and over, until he couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't help but vomiting off to the side. He didn't need anyone to tell him he had no affinity for fire, and left. In a way, Barrett was impressed that he had managed to participate in the tests of every school within the 1 week that they would be around. Of course, all of the immediate rejections helped to speed it along. Barrett sighed. Perhaps he wasn't meant to be strong at all. He would have to go somewhere, and live as a crafter or scribe or something. He could do that. It wouldn't be the worst fate, like staying with Denton and Melody, but it would be the end of him actually accomplishing anything. He looked around the entire recruitment event, just in case he had missed any. He found that he hadn't. He was exhausted, so he just found an empty area of dirt and lay down, staring up at the sky. There was nothing else he could do. He had given his all. It was a few minutes before he realized where he was. He was back at where he had started, next to the table and chair, and the man from the immortal Berserker sect. Barrett stood up, his eyes sharp. If once wasn't good enough, he would try again. Not that he had time to revisit everywhere, but he still wasn't going to give up until everything was over. Chapter 14. Barrett had a new fire of determination in his eyes. He was going to join a group and become strong, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop him. Of course, he knew how stupid the thought was. After all, he had no doubt that almost anyone here could beat him up easily, and there was anybody who would do anything about it. Someone might do something if he was about to get killed, but maybe that would only happen afterwards. Regardless, if he gave up because he was afraid, wouldn't he just remain weak? Next time, he would give up as well, and the time after that. He didn't want to live his life afraid of everyone. Maybe it would be better to be dead. Barrett wasn't sure, having never been dead, but he certainly didn't want to live the way he had been for the last few months. Barrett slapped his hand down on the table. Hey! I want to join your immortal Berserker sect. The man sitting there opened one eye. Why? Wait, didn't I already reject you? Go away. No way. Barrett didn't quite shout, but he spoke with energy. If I go away, what did I even come here for? The man shrugged, I don't know. Just go join someone else or something. I tried that. I tried all of them, and got rejected. Barrett regretted admitting that the instant he said it, but it was too late. So you came here hoping I would pick you up out of pity? The man shook his head, get real kid. The man closed his eyes again. That's not it at all. Barrett slammed his hand on the table again. I came here first, you know. Now I'm just coming back. The man did a very poor impression of snoring. Oh, don't give me that. Why are you even here? Why show up if you don't want a disciple? The man opened both eyes. Who says I don't already have all I need? Barrett raised an eyebrow, this place does. You don't have any here with you. If you had disciples you could have them do the boring stuff like recruiting too. I bet I'm the only one who even came up to the table. The man shrugged, yeah, so. Obviously somewhere else would be a better pick, then. You should take a hint. Why? You're strong, and you need a disciple, so it should be me. Oh. Why do you think I'm strong? The man flexed, is it because of these? Because that guy over there is bigger. It's because you're here. Barrett waved his hand to the right and to the left, showing all the empty space. Everyone else is all crammed together, but you have a huge area. You don't smell bad, so there must be a reason. Not everything has a reason. Sure, but this does. They gave you a lot of space, but nobody even looks at you. Maybe they don't like you, but maybe they're scared. If they just didn't like you they would kick you out. Therefore, you're strong, and should be my teacher. Why should I be your teacher? You're weak. That's exactly the point. I'm weak, so you should make me strong. A fair enough point. Let me just say this though. It's not just to deter you but, you'll die. I doubt it. You survived the same training, didn't you? He shrugged, sure I did. Let me be clear. Of the 10 disciples I took since I came here, 7 are dead, half of them within the first week. What about the rest of them? Those who didn't die quit after a year or 2. Oh. Barrett wasn't completely sure that he was telling the truth, but he hesitated. He didn't want to do some crazy training that just killed people. On the other hand, this man didn't actually seem crazy. Perhaps there was more to it. Why did they die? What else? They were just unlucky or unsuited to the training. Well, one of them was killed by someone. That's pretty harsh. Is the training that bad? Of course it is. Though, in a weak country like this it's pretty much a given. In better places the survival rate is upwards of 6 in 10. That's not much better. Barrett was strongly considering just finding somewhere else, but he didn't like any of them, and knew they wouldn't accept him. Besides, something felt right here. Can I join? Look, kid, you seem nice, so I'll just say this one more time. You'll die. Why risk it? Because I don't want to live in a world where I can't do anything. For that, I need to be strong. I hate to break it to you, but there will always be someone or something stronger than you. There's nothing you can do about it. At least I could, try. Instead of doing nothing. The man nodded. Then he closed his eyes for a few seconds. Finally, he finished thinking and opened them again. I'm Heikel. I'll tell you what, I'll give you a chance. I can guarantee that the beginning of the training is non-lethal. We'll see if you're suited for that part of it. If not, there's nothing I can do. Let me tell you though. This is a berserker style. You've gotta be angry. You don't look angry. You don't look angry either. Heikel nodded, good point. Anyway, you also have to be able to take a beating. Barrett frowned as he looked down at his hands, still wrapped in bandages. The physical wounds hurt, but they weren't the worst part of things. He nodded. Okay. Great. Heikel stood up. Let's go. Shouldn't you stay until the end of the event? Heikel raised an eyebrow. Do you see anyone else showing up? You're the only person who even came to my table in the last 2 years. Everyone else already knew better. Besides, I've got to get back to my own training. Can't waste my time here. With that, they were off. Barrett didn't know where to, except it was to the north. That could be many places. There were several more cities in Ashia before the mountains bordering with Etran. Chapter 15. Barrett found himself dripping with sweat. The bandages seemed like they would have made him more uncomfortable, but that wasn't actually the case. They were quite breathable and dried out very well. The rest of his clothes, however, constantly smelled. Master Heikel said they would have somewhere to wash when they got to their destination, and that he would be expected to do so. Barrett was dripping with sweat, not because it was hot, but because of exertion. The air was actually quite cool, which helped, but he was made to work harder than he thought he could. There were various exercises, such as things called push-ups, where he pushed down. Well, he pushed himself up, he supposed. Regardless, he did as many as he could, and then was made to do more. It was unpleasant and painful, but what Barrett learned was, he could do more. He just hadn't thought it was possible. In the morning, there were only light exercises. That was because he was expected to be able to walk over 40 kilometers each day as well. Barrett found that it was actually possible to do so much physical activity, and he hadn't expected it. It was barely possible, but without Master Heikel's encouragement it probably wouldn't have been. There was a lot of shouting involved, but instead of the type that made him feel bad about himself, he felt good. Being told at high volumes that he needed to do more, but also actually could was something. Barrett thought the second biggest contributor to his success was actually food. Master Heikel cooked huge amounts of food for the two of them. Barrett could eat however much he wanted to, which was a lot. The only restriction was that he had to also eat some vegetables and not just meat. So, he did. Barrett wasn't really sure where all of the food came from. He saw Master Heikel bring down a deer and roast it, but they had that meat for a few days, and he hadn't seen where it was. Usually he was doing exercises while the cooking was happening, but one time he looked over and saw that Master Heikel pulled various things out of his bag, and there was no way they could have all fit inside it. After the first week was over, Barrett felt exhausted. He didn't think he could do any more. Surprisingly, he didn't have to. Today is a day off. Besides walking, we won't have you do any other exercise. Remember, Barrett, rest is important. If you don't give your body time to recover, it will get worse instead of better. Nothing can overcome that, not even expensive medicines. That doesn't mean you can be lazy, but knowing when to rest is important. Barrett nodded. I understand. Barrett thought about whether he should continue with what he wanted to say, but decided he had to. So, you said that half of the people died in the first week of training. I don't feel like you're the kind of person who would let that happen to your students, and I haven't felt at risk of death. Oh. Well, I certainly don't want my disciples to die. No sane master does. However, the training has that element of risk. Master Heikel scratched his chin. Oh, did you think we'd started the actual training? No, this is just basic fitness. We can't really start the real training until then. Then he grinned, I kind of like you, so I'll give you one more chance to back out then. Barrett paled. This wasn't even the real training yet. He couldn't imagine how brutal the real training must have been. On the other hand, it didn't make any sort of sense with what Master Heikel talked about. He even mentioned that the body shouldn't be pushed past what it could bear. If so, what was it that caused people to die? Well, here we are, Master Heikel declared. Barrett looked ahead. This is a cliff face. He looked around, but didn't see anything else. Well, the cliff face fell off over to the east, but there were no other features. Barrett examined the cliff face more closely. Was there a hidden entrance or something? Master Heikel patted him on the shoulder. It's up there. He pointed toward the top of the cliff. I don't see anything there either. Trust me, it's there. So, before we get to the training, we just have to go this last little bit. Master Heikel walked up and touched the cliff face, then turned toward Barrett. Oh, I suppose it's possible for you to die climbing this before you start the training. No one has yet, but I suppose that's because some of them gave up. He shrugged, I just want you to know, I'm not going to catch you if you fall. See you at the top. Barrett watched Master Heikel climb. He was swift, taking almost no time to think about what he was doing. Barrett was in a daze for the first few moments, but then he concentrated. He hadn't climbed a cliff face before, but it couldn't be too hard. Even so, he had to pay attention to the route. It was only a few minutes before Master Heikel had reached the top of the cliff face that was at least 100 meters tall. Are you coming? Master Heikel shouted down from the top. Or are you just going to give up? When phrased like that, Barrett knew he wasn't going to give up. He could do it. Sure, he may not have climbed something like this before, but surely, he could get off the ground. It took him a few tries for that. He placed his hand and foot on some slight protrusions, but just ended up pushing himself away from the cliff face. He recalled how Master Heikel had stuck to the rock face, almost rubbing himself against it. He tried again, and actually got himself up off the ground. It took a few tries, with him falling off every time he made a mistake, before he could get both feet off the ground and start going up. He looked up, and found he hadn't really made any progress. He continued, grabbing for handholds and footholds he thought Master Heikel had used. One arm, one foot, other foot, one thing at a time. He looked up again, and didn't feel any closer. One more arm. Then his foot slipped, and he fell. He landed flat on his back, with the air knocked out of him. It was a few minutes before he could even function again, just looking up. He realized he'd barely made it anywhere. It had been at most 3 or 4 meters up. Barrett stood up. He craned his neck, and couldn't imagine making it to the top. This was it, then. He would have to give up here. Otherwise, he could die. Of course, he could die doing something else too. He could get lost and run out of food, or die in an accident as a laborer, or get sick. Master Heikel looked down at him from the top of the cliff. He couldn't see his expression. Still, Barrett wondered if he really wanted to call him master. It was the same question of whether he wanted to be strong. The answer was yes. He wanted to be strong. He couldn't stand being weak anymore, and the worst thing that could happen to him was not trying. It would be even worse than death. Chapter 16. Barrett stretched his body. It was a bit sore from the fall, but it would work fine. However, Barrett still couldn't imagine making it to the top of the cliff. So, he stopped looking up. He reached out in front of him. The path he was on before had been fine, he just hadn't been doing it right. In a minute or two he found himself back where he was. Just above him, that little bit had been where Master Heikel grabbed. It was just within his reach. He grabbed, and pulled. No, that wasn't quite right. He extended his legs, and took another step up. His arms were just there for support. Master Heikel had already told him that arms were weaker than legs. That helped, and he made it a bit further. His head was only slightly tilted back, just enough so that he could see the next spot to climb to. He had to concentrate to remember where Master Heikel had climbed, but without that he would have no idea. His memory was pretty good when he tried, but he still couldn't remember everything from just seeing it once. Eventually, he chose wrong, and a small bit of rock broke off, causing him to slip. Somehow, he just barely held on, and returned his foot to where he had been before. If he fell now, would he die? Barrett wasn't sure. He avoided looking down, so he couldn't tell. Likewise, he didn't look up very far. He couldn't afford to realize that he had made no progress. It was just 1 foot, 1 hand, 1 foot, 1 hand. Barrett was wearing out, and he began to think he couldn't do it. He was just a normal person. Well, the fallen son of a noble, which made him worse than a normal person in some ways. Could he really hold on? The answer was yes. Over the previous weeks, Master Heikel had told him he could do more. There was that, and there was also more. Like the strange finger exercises he had been made to do, and the balancing on his toes on the edge of a log. He had been trained to be able to do this. Was it enough? Barrett didn't know the answer to that, so all he could say was, it was enough. It had to be. 1 arm, 1 leg. The hardest part wasn't just holding himself up. It was finding the next place to move, then the transition. Along with that, there were other mental stresses, like the friction. His body rubbed against the cliff, his fingers scraped on the rock, even through the bandages. His feet rubbed against his shoes, the same shoes he'd had for a long time. He hadn't thought to get new shoes when he had Simon buy him clothes. The shoes had already been bad, and then they were further worn by walking. In addition to that, his feet had blisters. He'd gotten used to them while walking, but now he really felt them. His shoes were even slippery. Finally, he could bear it no more. He held onto the cliff with 1 hand and foot, and removed a shoe. Placing his foot on the cliff face directly, he felt cold and rough, but his foot fairly easily conformed to the cliff. Shakily, he did the same thing on the other side. Then, he continued climbing. Barrett wasn't sure if he'd made the right choice, since his feet weren't used to not having shoes. It wasn't long before they were bleeding, and slippery. That was a problem. He wasn't sure what he could do, but he felt his bandages start shifting downward. He rubbed his leg against the cliff, and they shifted even more. Finally they were around his ankles, but they couldn't really go further, except he saw them move on their own and wrap around his feet and toes, though he had to briefly pick each one up to let them get all the way. Barrett almost laughed. Magic bandages. Then he sighed. That beggar probably hadn't known what he had. If only he had been able to find him again. But it was too late now. The bandages did a good job of soaking up the blood, and keeping his feet safe from further injury. They also had surprisingly good grip. His fingers were used more, but they also started to become raw, and the bandages began to cover them as well. Was it responding to his desire, or did the bandages just naturally cover injured areas? Before, he had always wrapped them where he needed them on his own, so he hadn't discovered they could do this. Well, he supposed it didn't matter. He still had to get to the top of this cliff. 1 arm. 1 leg. Other arm, other leg. Finally, he reached the point where he could go no further. His muscles had given out. He recalled Master Heikel's voice. It said, you can do more, but he couldn't. He'd already hit his limit. He'd heard that voice. He'd done more. His hands and feet were numb, and he almost couldn't tell that he was touching anything. It was starting to get cold. Had he been climbing long enough for the weather to change? He didn't have the energy to climb any further. If he let go, his hands would never grab again. But, if he stopped, he knew what would happen. He didn't look down to see how high he was, but from this height he would die. His mind was drained from constantly trying to remember exactly where Master Heikel had moved. His consciousness and muscles could barely hold on. Well, perhaps he could do just one more. He might as well die trying. His vision was blurry, and he couldn't see the next handhold. He fumbled around with his hand, but it was so numb he felt nothing. He tried to grab, but it didn't seem like he found any purchase. Then, he felt his body slipping, and with it his consciousness. Chapter 17. Barrett woke up. That was nice, he supposed. His muscles hurt, and especially his fingers and toes, but they were just sore. It wasn't actually that unpleasant. As for where he wasn't exactly sure. It was dark, and he was laying on the floor. That was what he felt when he reached out to the side, though he had a thin mattress immediately beneath himself. Barrett sat up. There was just enough light for him to navigate toward the door. He hadn't been sure if he wanted to get up until he smelled food, and then he had been sure he wanted to. He seemed to have been in something like a small hut. It was dark outside as well, but he saw the flicker of a fire. As he walked toward it, he saw Master Heikel. Oh. Finally up. Master Heikel patted the log next to him. Come on over. It's food time. Great, I'm starving. Barrett went over. He tried to remember what he had been doing before he woke up. Right, climbing the cliff. He had been going and then, he remembered falling. Maybe. That part wasn't so clear. Congratulations on making it to the top. You did well. Master Heikel took a bite of one of the sausages he had been cooking on the fire. Tomorrow morning you can decide whether you want to go ahead with the actual training. If not, you can walk down the mountain into the town. It's not a bad place. It even has some schools full of warriors. Now that you've toughened up a bit, one of them might take you in. Barrett wasn't really sure he wanted to traverse that cliff again, but more importantly he didn't want to give up now that he was here. I'll continue. Master Hylek waved his hand dismissively. I told you, you can decide in the morning. I'll be going over the details of the training, and why so many people die in the first week. Barrett nodded. There was still that. Dying would ruin the whole thing where he got stronger. Still, giving up and going to another place would be, well, it didn't seem quite right. He would at least listen to the full explanation, but for now, he would eat. The morning started with breakfast. Master Heikel would not start with the explanation until afterwards. Apparently, meals were sacred. All right, kid. Time for explanations. On the way here you've done basic training of your body. However, warriors need more than that. Oh, sure, your body can get you pretty far, but there are limits of various sorts. I won't go into it all here, but believe me, I know. Your physical body is just one piece of the puzzle. Well, for wizards and stuff, they would rather do without that piece entirely. Heikel shook his head. Anyway, that wasn't my point. The point is, you need more. A type of energy. Wizards call their mana, but we've got a different version much more suited to us. Even among warriors, there are different ways to generate it, and it gets used differently. Master Heikel pointed to two pillars off in the distance. As that sign says, we're the immortal Berserker sect, so we use Berserk energy. The sign is facing the other way. Of course it is. Master Heikel grinned. You don't need to see it, it's the people out there who do. Anyway, we use Berserk energy. We generate it through anger and other intense feelings, and use it to crush our energy. It's very strong, but a bit dangerous to ourselves as well. Thus, we toughen up our bodies. We have a method for that, but it has a long recovery process. Master Heikel took a breath, but we have a method for that. We'll inevitably get injured whether we do it to ourselves or others do it to us, so we came up with a way to recover more quickly. He took the knife he had been cutting with, and shoved it into his palm. Blood flowed out. Look at this. Barrett leaned closer. It was actually not a very large injury. Just the tip of the knife had gone in. Still, blood dripped out. However, as he watched, the wound sealed up. Within a few seconds, the wound had sealed up. Over the course of the next minute, the wound had healed up as if it were never there. Ever heard of an immortal body, kid? Barrett shook his head. Of course not. Most people haven't. Anyway, there are a very few people who are born with bodies that heal faster. We replicate that. What you just saw here was healing at about 10,000 times the normal rate. That's what we call a Tier 1 immortal body. That's about the point where it becomes relevant in combat, about a day's worth of healing every 10 seconds. Tier 2 is about 10 times that, 100,000 times the normal rate. You get about a day in a second. That means you can shrug off most wounds, as long as you don't bleed to death, and if it's even possible to recover. You're not gonna grow back an arm or a head no matter how long you wait. Anyway, our school aims to duplicate that ability through training. Master Heikel looked at his palm. Of course, it's not as good as being born with it. It took me decades to get this far. Still, it's not the only thing we have going for us. Barrett nodded. So, with all of this trying to make yourself die less, how does it become fatal? Master Heikel nodded seriously. That's the core of the whole thing. We increase the body's ability to heal, by destroying some of the parts that let it heal. Of course, we use a special infusion of energy in a specific method, otherwise it would all be over. The end result is, there's a chance to add on another level of healing to what you possess naturally. Everyone has different results. I have more than 8 parts in 10 chance of it working, and the rest of the time, I regress. This means I still make significant progress, but also that I had about a 20% chance of dying at the start of the training. If I was unlucky, I might have even gone back from the second stage to the first two, nothing. He shook his head. Needless to say, someone with no healing ability doesn't last long. So, those who aren't suited or just unlucky, they die. Still want to join? Chapter 18. Barrett didn't know what to say. He didn't really want to leave his fate to luck. Is there any way to tell who is suited? Without just trying it out? Master Heikel shook his head. There's no way to know your chance of success until you have used the technique for some time. At least, no way that we've found. Well, one factor is your affinity for the underlying technique, but we've had some excellent candidates die, either on the first step, or sometimes even later because their ratios weren't good enough. Oh. Barrett nodded. I don't really want to gamble on the future like that, but I know everyone takes risks. Is it possible to practice the base technique to know how suited I am? Master Heikel nodded. It is. We're not particularly worried about people knowing the basics, because it's worthless if you just learn it and leave. The real weaknesses of the technique are in the risks during training, and not something people can easily use against us. Especially with just the first part. I would like to remind you that everyone who actually tried showed a decent level of affinity for the technique, and many still died anyway. You're a whole lot kinder than the front you put on. Master Heikel shrugged. I get grumpy thinking of dying students. I'm still looking for the right one. He shook his head. It's probably not you either, but I'll give you the chance. At least you have some determination. Now then, to start, you have to get some energy. Master Heikel stretched his arms out to the side. Try to pay attention as much as possible to what you see, hear, and most importantly feel. Barrett focused on Master Heikel. It quickly became apparent what he was supposed to pay attention to. He saw a sort of swirling in front of each of his palms. It was a sort of white mist, but it also looked something like a rock causing ripples in a pond, except instead of water it was air. Barrett sort of felt something from that, but he wasn't sure what. Then, Master Heikel slapped both of his hands together. There was a resounding boom, and Barrett was knocked onto his back. By the time he picked himself up, the ringing in his ears had lessened. I thought it would be red. Master Heikel shook his head. It doesn't really look like anything. He held up a hand, in which was nothing. See? It's only when you start doing something with it that it looks like something. Barrett narrowed his eyes as he looked at the nothing. Was it really nothing, or? He thought he felt the something there, even though he couldn't say what sense it was with. Okay. How do I do that? This? You can't yet. But we can teach you to start. Master Heikel explained the process of refining the energy, how to move it around inside him, and where he could store it. Some of it would spread out through the body, but most of it would stay in his torso. What would happen if you just put some of it in me? You'd explode. Master Heikel shrugged. Well, I have good enough control that I could prevent you exploding, but even just a small amount of energy would cause problems. It is Berserk energy after all. Your body has to be strong, though if the energy is yours you can handle it much better. Now then, you have the method of refining the energy. All you need is a source. In this case, we'll start with anger. It's the easiest and most suited. So, think of what makes you angry, and refine that anger into energy you can use. Don't rush it though. It should take some time. Barrett nodded. Anger, that was easy. He was angry that his family had died. He didn't know who or what to be angry at, but he was. There was no way it could have been an accident, or it couldn't have gotten so bad before he woke up. Who could have caused it then? He had some ideas, but didn't know why. Barrett already felt like his blood was boiling. He tried to use the method to refine energy, but as he concentrated he lost hold on the anger. Recalling the same thing didn't have the same effects again right away. Unfortunately, Barrett had more. His aunt and cousin were some of the worst family anyone could ever have. Making him be a servant, but treating him more like a slave. The stupid work, the beatings, that brought the rage back into his heart. He tried to hold on to it as he refined it, but it slipped away again. Well, there was more. They stopped the bankers from helping him, they made it impossible for him to go anywhere else. Still, it slipped away after some time. Barrett honestly felt better that the anger went away, but it wasn't really helping his progress if it did that. His thoughts shifted to the bankers themselves. They wouldn't even give him his money, and had refused to even see him. That was just because of how he was dressed, and it was only later that he thought they recognized him and forbade him entrance for that. Then there was the Church of Ristos that was full of hypocrites. What sort of god of prosperity only helped those who were already prosperous? Sure, there were a few who got food handouts, but not as many as there should have been. Barrett found himself trembling in rage, then he tried the technique again. Then, it slipped away again. Barrett fell onto his back and started up at the sky. He had so many unpleasant memories going through his mind, and he couldn't even get angry over them anymore. Instead, he just felt nothing. Also tired. He hadn't done much of anything but he was exhausted. He wasn't even sure if he could sit up. I I might be very bad at this. Master Heiko's voice came from nearby, maybe, but we don't know that yet. This is normal. I thought I was supposed to be refining energy, but instead I'm completely out of energy. Every time I tried to use the technique my anger just slipped away. Yep. That sounds about right. Don't worry about it. So, Barrett didn't. Mostly because he fell asleep right there on the grass and dirt. Chapter 19. The next day, Barrett was able to get angry about everything again, with similar results in his training. When he tried to refine it into energy, everything drained away and he became sluggish. He wondered if he was even capable of this technique, or would just have to give up. Master Heiko didn't seem concerned at all, though. Barrett did do well enough in training his body later the second day. All of the exercises were designed to push him, but not quite as far as they had before. Apparently, he needed to keep some energy for other things. Based on how exhausted he was feeling at the end, he knew that was true. The third day, Barrett thought about that energy refining technique. He was supposed to be making a kind of berserk energy. Why wasn't it working? What was he doing wrong? He thought about it. The most important thing was that Master Heiko had told him something. He told him to pay attention to the energy, and him using it. He concentrated on the feeling he'd gotten at that time. He tried to ignore the looks that it gave off, and sensed the feeling. It took some times, minutes, maybe half an hour. He wasn't sure, but he finally got a lock on the feeling. It was as if it were right next to him and not just a memory. Then Barrett realized, of course it felt like it was next to him. Well, it should have felt a bit closer, because it was in him. It was real. Sure, it was just the tiniest wisps of energy, but it was there. As for it being berserk, it did seem to be thrashing around a lot, but it seemed to have very little actual effect on anything. Barrett tried to control it, but to little success. He couldn't tell whether its movements were due to his will or random movement. He shook his head. He supposed it didn't matter yet. What mattered was, he was making progress. No wonder Master Heiko hadn't been worried. This time, he concentrated on the energy inside him as he tried to refine the anger. He saw more and more wisps of it appear, until it was almost double what it had been. He found that concentrating on this particular side of it was more efficient, and more pleasant. Of course, he was still tired afterwards, but he could see the progress. Energy was coming out of him and his body, and becoming something else. Hopefully, it would be something he could use. Barrett hadn't believed the whole time frame of a week of training, but he found he could make more berserk energy with less effort as the days went on. On the fourth day, he had been taught how to guide the energy. It made sense, but he hadn't thought of seating anger in front of the path he wanted it to travel. The real trick, though, was making it move just as much as he wanted and where. He found if it moved too quickly, it was painful. As for where the pain was, that was harder to describe, except inside of him. Either way, it wasn't good. His senses became more attuned to the energy as well, and he could feel Master Heiko when he moved around. It was significantly muted, but he felt it inside of him nonetheless. If he had to compare, Barrett himself had about a drop compared to a lake. Perhaps that wasn't correct, because he couldn't actually tell, but he knew he was pretty insignificant. He wasn't exactly sure what could be done with all that energy, but based on how much effort it took to obtain, there must have been a proportionately large amount of power. At the end of the week, Master Heiko came to Barrett. Well, this is it. You won't be able to progress much further without really beginning the training. I can say your affinity is decent enough. You should be able to progress unless you're unlucky. He patted Barrett on the shoulder. Besides, there's a chance you won't die even if it goes poorly. If you have a bit better than regular healing, you can be left with a small amount of ability to recover. Isn't that wonderful? He sighed and shook his head. The choice is yours though. I can't say you will definitely succeed, just that you won't certainly fail. What I promise is that if you do succeed, I can make you strong, as long as you stay determined to become so. Barrett nodded. He took a deep breath. He felt the berserk energy and its danger, and yet he also felt he was quite suited for it. That was justified by nothing, it was just a feeling, but he couldn't shake the thought. He also liked Master Heiko, and wanted to be strong. Certainly, he could go find someone else to train him, but if he gave up on this he didn't think he would keep the determination to go on. If he succeeded the first time and failed the second, going back to the start, he would be justified in giving up. It would seem to be unsuited for him, but as it was, he seemed more likely to succeed than fail. I will do it. Master Heiko nodded. Very well. Then, pay close attention to what I do. Remember, pay attention exactly. If you're slightly off it can be deadly with no chance of recovery, or just wasted injuries that will take time to recover from. Master Heikel sat cross-legged and concentrated. Barrett could see he was very serious. As he watched, it seemed as if Master Heikel opened himself up to be seen. He watched the flow of energy. Here. Master Heikel's energy swirled around one part, and here, and here. These 3 points. Then he released a slow breath, before inhaling quickly. It is best to destroy them all simultaneously. Then Barrett heard a popping sound. He saw the few points were crushed, and Master Heikel spat out a mouthful of blood. Ah, how unlucky. You get to see a failure. He shook his head, not that it is too dangerous at this point. I would have to fail thousands of times to be in trouble. Give me a moment. After a few minutes, Master Heikel's face went from pale to somewhat neutral. If you wait, I can demonstrate a success as well, but the technique is exactly the same. This time it just reacted poorly. Master Heikel shrugged, just to be clear, this is definitely the best way. The Immortal Berserker sect has had a very long time to work on the technique. The results have been very clear. Unless something goes significantly wrong, the results are up to the individual's body and affinity with the technique. Barrett nodded seriously. He didn't like the idea of a gamble, but in essence, he only had to gamble once. Once he made progress, he would have something to fall back on if he regressed. I understand. I saw what you did. I can do it. He told himself that, and he even believed it for the most part. He first focused on calming himself. He couldn't let any mistakes be on his own part. This was his first step to becoming strong. He could not fail. To that end, he avoided thinking about the possible consequences. Such thoughts would be of no use. Chapter 20. Barrett took the time to center himself and concentrate to his very limits. This wasn't something he could afford to mess up on. Of course, he wasn't some sort of superhuman who could completely clear his mind, especially not when doing something this dangerous, but given the circumstances he achieved what he thought was the optimal level of calm. He went over the steps in his head. He concentrated on remember the exact points that he needed to destroy. He could still almost feel the energy and damage in Master Heikel. Once he was ready, he started immediately. Any hesitation would just throw him off. First, he had to wrestle the Berserk energy into his control. It was only a tiny amount, and even though the energy belonged to him, it was difficult. Finally, though, he got a strong mental grip on it. Then he directed it. He tried going toward all 3 points at once, but that was too difficult. Instead, he directed it toward one point near the heart. Then he held that part of the energy there before moving on to the next parts. Finally, he had everything where it should be. After checking over one more time to make sure he wasn't off, he detonated the energy. Barrett woke up later. His entire chest ached. He could only vaguely recall intolerable pain, but he'd passed out, and thus hadn't felt it for long. This was more of a dull throb. Hopefully, that was good. Well, it didn't seem like he was dead, but perhaps he was dying. Honestly though, Barrett didn't think that was the case. He'd felt worse before, especially directly after the fire. Still, he could move, and since he was hungry, he felt it was time to get up. When he stood, there was a brief moment of dizziness, but it passed quickly. Finally, he found Master Heikel outside. He was cooking again. He seemed to have great timing with such things. Good morning. Master Heikel turned toward him. Good morning. How are you feeling? Barrett held his hand up to his chest, not great, but not like I'm dying. Master Heikel nodded, you seem to have succeeded. Now, all we have to do is wait a year for you to recover. Barrett blinked, what? A year? Sure. Do you think this kind of thing heals quickly? Take note that I heal at 10,000 times normal speed and it took me several minutes to feel better, and that's not a full recovery. Master Heikel grinned, don't worry, you're not going to be sitting around doing nothing. There are many things you need to learn that don't involve any danger to your health. Okay. What first? Well, let's start with some basics. Why do we use energy instead of just our body? Because, it's strong. We need it to train our healing. Master Heikel shrugged, sure, it's strong, but you know what else is strong? My physical body. He stood up and took a stance, then punched the ground. Barrett looked on intently, then frowned. Master Heikel's arm had sunk up to his wrist, but that was it. Nothing exciting happened. If this was rock instead of dirt, I could have cracked it, but that doesn't matter. Here is the point. There is now a hole in the dirt. Okay. Barrett nodded, and then frowned, I can see it doesn't seem the most useful on dirt, but putting a hole in something you were fighting doesn't seem like a problem. Right. Let's try something else then. Go stand next to that wall. Barrett did so. Now, push it over. Barrett looked at it. He didn't think there was any way to succeed at that, but he knew he should try. He lowered himself and pushed as hard as he could, to basically no results. Stop. Look at the ground. Barrett looked down. There was nothing particularly exciting, but after a moment he moved his feet. There were slight indents in the soft dirt where he had been standing. This is your first lesson. Even I cannot push down that wall with just my bodily strength, unless I have something to press against. If you press on a wall, or strike something, it presses back on you. Something will give out first. It might not be your body, but perhaps the ground beneath you. If you push straight into the wall, it will push you back instead, and there is even less holding you back. Master Heikel took the same stance a step over to the side. This time, Barrett could feel the berserk energy pouring through him. Then his fist came down, and he released the energy. There was a small crater left behind, and Master Heikel flew into the air. Then, he did it a third time, and this time he maintained his position on the ground. The resulting crater of dirt below him was about a meter wide, and perhaps half of that at its deepest point. Barrett noticed that the same amount of energy was used, but the result was very different. In fact, less energy ended up going into the ground, instead it moved upward, damaging nothing. Even so, it kept Master Heikel from flying up, and the energy directed toward the ground all actually arrived where intended. Well, it's like this. Master Heikel shrugged, the same thing applies in the other direction. Perhaps eventually you can lift a bull off the ground, but only if you want to sink up to your knees. That is, unless you spread out the weight across a larger area. Perhaps you could do it on stone, but if you're truly serious about growing strong, you will reach the point where each material progressively grows too weak to handle your relatively tiny form. No matter how strong you grow, you can't do anything about this with just your body. After all, it's not that you aren't strong enough, it's that everything else is too weak. Master Heikel grinned, including you, right now. I would suggest you don't punch rocks for a while. It's one of the worst ways to break your fingers and wrist.